grab your Zune because Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is officially out. Easily one of the most anticipated Marvel movies of the year, in a year that we have 3 very anticipated Marvel movies. I'm Terry Schwartz, this is Jim Faveda and Joshua Yale. We are here to talk about the movie. Full spoilers, we're gonna get into it. And goodness, I reviewed the movie, I've been waiting to get into the nitty gritty of spoilers. So this is your official warning. And we should start first with the obvious question. What did you guys think about the movie? I put 1,300 words onto the internet about my thoughts. I want to know what you guys think.
Comics lead? You go
I loved it. I really thought it was a lot of fun. And it wasn't perfect. It wasn't as good as the first one. I feel like a lot of people want to know that right out of the gate. But still, I had a great time revisiting these characters that I absolutely fell in love with in the first movie and got to see them grow and change, and a lot of them in meaningful ways. The soundtrack was amazing, and it was just a great space adventure.
I enjoyed it. Again, did not like it as much as the first movie. I thought it suffered from a lot of sequelitis, and I know we'll get into specifics on that, but I felt like it was trying so hard to be Guardians of the Galaxy again. The things that seemed to kind of come naturally in the first movie, it seemed like they were trying so hard to try and be funnier, be bigger, do more of, oh, you liked Baby Groot? Now there's way too much Baby Groot. There's too much of this. You reminded me sort of like when you have a 10-year-old who suddenly realizes they're funny because they made the room full of adults laugh, and then they keep trying to be funny to the point where the adults start getting annoyed with the kid. The movie started to feel like that to me.
Jim, I think we learned something about you a little bit more than we did about the movie. You're like, you make your funny, cute kid only cute for a little while. No, I really do agree with you, though. I mean, I should say Guardians of the Galaxy, the first film, is my favorite Marvel movie by a long shot. It's the one I always return to. It's such a blast to watch, and one of the things that I really love about it is that it's very audacious and in a way that feels effortless. I love that I realized right from that opening title sequence when, Peter Quill kicks the little alien and then he does this whole dance and is going around, and that's sort of our main entry point to that world. I really connected with that, and I agree with you. I think they saw the things that people loved about the first movie and doubled down on them, smart on paper, but it did, that whole Baby Groot opening sequence, I was like, oh, it does feel like you're trying to recreate that, but going really hard on Baby Groot. And this is all to say, I did really like the movie. I thought it was a very good movie. I thought it was a bit too jam-packed in a way that serviced the characters in an interesting way, but I did think sort of detracted from the story, and there were pacing issues in the sense that you lost track of sort of what the main thread of the movie was partway through before it's revealed, oh, it's because Ego is the villain the whole time, and maybe it was an intentional misdirect.
Yeah, I mean, I thought there was sort of a messiness to it that the original movie didn't have, and there was a sort of things were too obvious too. I think I could kind of see that the Ego twist coming a little bit. That didn't bother me, but there was no room for subtext in this movie. Anything that when somebody would say a line that it was the big theme spelled out for you. So there was, and I know, look, subtlety isn't something these movies are known for, but it was a little too much. Everything was too on the nose at times, I thought. And
Yeah, it felt a lot like Empire Strikes Back to me, because the group has gotten a little bigger. They need to split them in half, and so I know some people were like, "Oh, I want them to stay together the whole time." It's like, you're not gonna have that many leads on screen at the same time.
But finding out the villain is your father.
Yeah. So and then at the end he has to fight his father. So again, Empire Strikes Back, and I was like, oh,
Which is funny, because James Gunn in the past, when people were speculating about who Star-Lord's dad would be, and people were wondering, oh, maybe it's Thanos, he's like, no, that would be too obvious, too Empire. And it's like, you just traded from one different cosmic villain for another, where it was that.
And I do acknowledge what you guys are saying, that they're like, okay, people love Baby Groot, let's really shove him in your face. In fact, the entire opening sequence of the movie after the flashback is them fighting the boss monster, but it's just, the camera's just focused on Baby Groot being so adorable and dancing and stuff. And they do that. I actually thought that went on too long. They did the whole song, but when I think back on it, I'm just smiling. I'm like, that was so
Baby
cute.
Groot's adorable.
It's just
so it was almost too much.
I was aware of them trying to manipulate me and make callbacks, to the first movie and play up what really worked, and really doubling down on the same jokes and gags and stuff. But I was still, at the end of the day, I was smiling and laughing. I had a good time.
Yeah, I think something that worked for this movie that I think Age of Ultron is also a very messy Marvel sequel that was trying to do a lot. I think the thing that Guardians Volume Volume 2 had going for it is it was very self-contained. It was just a Guardian story. Like, Thanos was in it to the extent that Gamora and Nebula, that was a big part of sort of what they were dealing with as characters, but there weren't a lot of outside influences going in. But I mean, you're talking about like thinking back and smiling about it, and that's sort of, even when I like wrote the review and I settled on 7.9 because I figured that was very reflective on the, I know.
How
Everyone was
dare
like, oof, and I was like, no, it's very good, like on an IGN scale, and I stand by that. But I sort of was left with this like warm feeling because there's so much goodwill to the Guardians. They're such a fun team. I like all these characters, even though I was surprised that Drax had a lot more toilet humor and thought penises were a lot funnier than I realized in the last movie. I was like, why do they keep just talking about like poop jokes? But like, it's just so much fun to spend time with them that even if the movie had problems, I think one of the reasons that it is so enjoyable is because the characters and their chemistry is really enjoyable.
And I think a lot of that does speak to the casting too. I mean, I love Kurt Russell. He's one of my favorites.
Segue, Jim.
And I thought he was a great choice. You totally buy him as somebody who would be Peter Quill's dad, and it's great casting. And you know, you don't really ever get to see him play the bad guy, and the fact that he was a bad guy who was still legitimately in love, you know.
Well, so that's a good segue. The villain of this movie is a pretty big deal and a bit different, for all that it has Empire Strikes Back comparisons, is a bit different from the Marvel formula, where in this case we find out it is Ego, Star-Lord's dad. Now, I think there are a lot of criticisms, and many of them, you know, rightfully leveled at the MCU, that the villains are throwaway. And one of the things I thought was really interesting about Ego being the villain is that even though, yes, he's defeated in this movie, that's the end of his story, I truly believe they could be talking about Ego as a character and his impact on Star-Lord's life in Infinity War, in Guardians Volume 3. Like, I think that has a really interesting lingering effect on this character in a way that other Marvel movies or villains necessarily haven't. But I'm curious to know what you guys thought of Ego eventually being the big bad.
Yeah, I thought, you know, like Ronan, for example, he brought a lot of intensity to the role, and I think that's why people liked him maybe a little more than the average Marvel villain, which, yeah, a lot of them are very throwaway. But Ego, he definitely struck a different chord because you get so much time getting to know him. Because we like Peter, we want him to like his dad. We like his dad. It's Kurt Russell. He's very charming, you know. But of course, and then it's very, you know, as you kind of get into the movie, you realize something's not quite right, and then of course you get the big reveal. And just a side note, I love how he's got all those like sculptures of him that like easily explain the plot. And then, but there's one that also, as it continues to go, it shows him like boinking more and more different aliens. I'm like, why do you have that in your lobby, in your foyer,
we were joking
dude?
about that afterwards. Like, I mean, granted, he can create the planet to be whatever he wants, but I love just like the idea going into the Ego element of, oh yes, he has all these like massive orbs that are, you know, represent the plot of his life. Like,
yeah, but I mean, think about it. It's kind of in fitting with mythology and the sort of the idea, if this guy is essentially a god, like Greek gods were all about themselves. They had horrible egos, and they, you know, and it was all about sort of telling their stories and worshiping themselves, and you know, and I think it was interesting that, okay, if he's named Ego, let's run with it. And you know, I think it's also interesting that, you know, Kurt Russell could bring, oddly enough, a humanity to a living planet, and I think you needed somebody like that. I think if you had gone the straightforward, let's say, just British stage actor role of someday I am Ego, the living planet, like it just wouldn't work. It wouldn't, you wouldn't connect with that character. I will say, however, that I found it really kind of annoying that ultimately a bomb can kill anything, even a planet. Just a little, you know, it's such a...
We had special space batteries attached to the bomb.
So. And Groot pressed the button that gives it extra power.
He finally got it right.
I sort of like wrote it off, but that whole final battle, for all that, the fallout of it was amazing. Like that third act, we'll talk about it a little bit with the Yondu of it all, but it was so like a stereotypical like superhero movie final battle where like for some reason there was like a massive, I don't even know, like column that Gamora and Nebula just happened to be able to take. Like, what, it was such gobbledygook in terms of what was actually happening in that scene, but I thought the emotional
you lose the through line though of like, okay, what can this being actually do? You've lived billions of years, you can transform matter, and yet if they kill your physical form, it takes you like 20 minutes to come back, you know?
Well, they put him to sleep. that was like Mantis put him to sleep, so that was part of it. I don't know. I thought it tracked. I just thought visually it was like a mess, but they sort of had to be doing something.
Yeah. There's a lot going on.
Joshua, I am curious because I sat next to you when we watched this movie, and there was one moment that made you like jump and get really excited. Well, many, but in regards to Ego, how did you think that this movie did him justice as a comic book character?
So I loved the nod to his original, because in the comics he's an actual living planet with a giant face on it, and there's that scene. It's when Rocket and Yondu are going back down to the planet, and they show. It just sort of the surface of the planet. You can see a face in it.
It looks very similar to the comics.
It looks so good. So I was really happy with that. In the comic books, Peter Quill's father is Jason of Spartax, who's sort of he just rules like an empire. He's like a despot. He's like not a very good guy, and Peter has to sort of deal with that. But he's just like a normal human guy with no. Not human, well, yeah, but alien, but human guy, humanoid guy who's with no powers or anything. So I thought actually this was a nice, like a pleasant surprise and a nice, really interesting way to go. And again, tracking more for that Empire Strikes Back thread of him learning to use the power inside of him. I like that a lot. And then
he gets it taken away.
I thought it was really cute how. Like Ego really had him figured out and knew what he wanted, and it was like throwing the ball with everything.
So funny.
That was so great. I just thought, they really took a very smart approach to that, and it really was an emotional villain that we normally aren't used to.
And I love the visual effects of de-aging Kurt Russell. I know they said that they used some makeup for that.
Yeah,
but
it's actually mostly makeup and then some slight touch-ups from there versus sort of the Michael Douglas Ant-Man.
I mean, he looked just like Kurt Russell from 1980. It was
that
surreal,
hair.
And the hair. I want to point out one thing. I don't know if anybody else is pointing it out, but there's sort of it kind of fits with the timeline of the late 70s, early 80s stuff that they were going for, but he's almost sort of a malevolent Mork from Ork. Like the alien that comes, even his hair, like he come in the red jacket and all that stuff. It kind of had like a Mork thing going on of like he meets the Earth Woman and all that kind of. Even his ship is kind of looks egg-like, So I'm just wondering, if there wasn't something there, and if there wasn't anything there, it still looks like Mork to me.
Before we move on from villains, obviously there were two misdirect villains in this movie. One who I'm guessing we'll see a lot more in Guardians Volume 3, who is Aisha, the leader of the Sovereign, who we'll get into this also in a little bit, but created Adam Warlock at the end of this movie. Very exciting. And then the other, Taserface, the leader of the villainous Ravagers, who gets blown away, and I don't imagine we'll see him again.
I love that we even start chuckling when you say Taserface, because that's the whole joke in the movies. They laugh whenever somebody says
I mean, Jim, what do you think about these two other villains? What do you think they brought to
I thought
the movie?
Taser and the Ravagers thing went on way too long. Even, like, they brought him out to Comic-Con last year, and that bit went on way too long. Like, it was funny it would have been funnier in a smaller dose than what we got, but I think they were there ostensibly to be able to kill a bunch of these guys and not have you be upset with it. To show off Yondu and the Arrow and have Baby Groot, just to see little Baby Groot get mad and kill a guy, basically. Elizabeth Debicki, I thought was fine as Aisha. I did think the Sovereign. I love how pompous they were, and I love that joke. Although ultimately they kind of felt like an SNL skit a little bit to me. But I did like I thought that was a case of they did just kind of enough with them. They didn't overdo that one like they did the Ravagers.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, and I know, Joshua, you sort of have an opposing opinion, but I agree. I feel like I expected the Sovereign to play a lot flatter than they were, and I thought they were like surprisingly funny, and Elizabeth Debicki in particular like brought just the right amount of making us laugh at how self-serious and pompous
I wonder if
Aisha
it isn't
was.
kind of poking fun too at Hollywood and all that kind of thing.
I'm curious, Joshua, what did you think
deep,
about
Jim.
these two?
They all look like Oscars,
Yeah, I thought Aisha was like, I think more on Jim's level. She was fine. I guess here's the thing: the Sovereign never became a threat to me. Like, I know they were chasing them with their ships and stuff, but Ego, they just like wiped them out like they were nothing. And then later in the film, they come back with another fleet of remote-controlled drones, but they weren't like upgraded, and they weren't like a better kind, or they weren't like more deadly with them.
5 days.
Well, I don't know. I thought like you need to like up your game a bit. If you failed the first time, they didn't know that Ego wasn't going to help them, or it wasn't going to take them out the second time. I don't know. I felt like they need to up their game further, and it's just because she was flying one in the end, didn't suddenly like, ooh, watch out. Like, is she like a proficient like fighter pilot? She's like Anakin Skywalker over here. Like, I don't know. Or more Poe Dameron. Anakin wasn't very good.
You were thinking pod racing Anakin.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was kind of weird. And Taserface, that made me laugh. Although I do agree, it was kind of dragged out a little longer, and they wanted just like they wanted fodder for an action scene. Because in the first movie, we actually did get a lot of that. Remember Groot like horribly killing those guys with his arm, then smashing them against the wall until they were just like all limp. Like that was, I think they wanted something like that in this one. Something that made you go, ooh, but also laugh.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that they did have like a lot of those fight scenes sort of going back, like, you know, they knew what they needed to one up from the first movie and did it a lot. I do want to transition over to the characters. The Guardians make this movie what they are, and in this movie, whereas the first film was about bringing the team together, this one was very much about testing their bond as family. That is the theme that is like written
breaking
in the
chain,
sky.
if
Yeah.
you will. Yes.
Which a good reference to the Awesome Mix Volume 2. I did really like the character work done in this movie. I thought Groot was Rocket was the only one who I would have liked to know a little bit more about his past, though I did like the connection they created with him and Yondu. I thought that the sister stuff between Gamora and Nebula was really rich. I was genuinely surprised about the fact that the reason why Nebula is like a cyborg or whatever is because every time Gamora beat her in a battle, Thanos took a part of her. I was that like gives me chills thinking about it. That's like so dark and immediately like makes you view these characters in a new way. And I think that that's the best thing a movie franchise like this can do. And then obviously, you know, we learned a lot about Peter as well and his past and sort of his Hasselhoff desires for a father. But, you know, I'm curious, what do you guys think about what they did with the characters?
I think they could have done a little more, frankly, with Peter. I mean, he gets these powers and his own ego, if you will. Like, you know, he can be, he's kind of an a-hole at times in this movie, but that's kind of his thing. But I thought they kind of pulled their punch. Like, they didn't want him to be as much of a jerk. So thus, he didn't really quite have the arc I thought he would. I know that they you know, ultimately it's about him trying to reconnect with his father and all that, but
I agree with you. Gamora kept saying, "You're so pompous," and I was like, I don't know. He seems sort of like
he didn't seem as bad as he did the first time. You know, like so. I thought they could have done a little something more there, especially if he's going to have these newfound abilities. Like now he really is a Star-Lord. You know, he's earned his name. So I thought they could have done something a little bit more with that. I did like the stuff they did with Rocket. However, you know, I thought maybe he would have kind of covered that sort of beat in the first movie. Like, you know, he's the jerk on the team. Well, why is he a jerk? Well, because he's hurting. We knew that already. Like, that's not exactly new information. But I loved the Gamora and Nebula stuff. And I also like the new characters. I really liked Mantis. And I liked what and I liked a lot of the setup, and I know we'll get to the spoiler stuff, but the setup for other stuff yet to come, I thought that excited me, you know, even more than some of the revisiting elements that we've already kind of covered in the first movie.
I actually liked how they took a lot of elements, things that we had maybe just heard about in the first movie, brought them back up in this one, like Gamora and Nebula growing up together with Thanos, or like Yondu saving Peter, and then like but saying, "Hey, I saved you from being eaten," and it's like, what? Like that doesn't make any sense. But now we finally know like the reasons behind all of these things and why these characters are the way they are. So they went back, you know, made these references to the first movie, did like new arcs out of those things, and then pushed the characters forward in what I thought was a meaningful way. I was into it. I was really into the story. I very much Nebula Gamora. Like that was my absolute favorite from the movie. Nebula surprised me. I'm so glad we got so much more material of her because she brought so much heart and so much like empathy to a character who's half cyborg. And then she was also really funny too. She was making me laugh all the time. And I thought Gamora also got a better shake this movie. I feel like she was like the butt of a lot of the jokes and didn't really quite find her footing in the first one, even though I do really like her character, but I thought it was a lot better in this one, except for the stuff that had to do with Peter. I thought they're like, will they, won't they, do they like each other, do they not, but they're mad at each other, and now they're going to make up. All of that was I was like a little over it before it even began. And for Peter himself, I do like his character in this, but I feel like he actually didn't get enough to do. And it is like an ensemble, but he's the core, but he didn't quite feel like he was the core until the very end where he had to be to save the universe.
I like that you were sort of like checking the photo to make sure we were getting everyone, which I think goes to the point that there are a lot of characters being juggled in this movie. The character who most surprised me as being ultimately the heart of this movie was Yondu, though.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought that, especially throughout the movie, sort of what we learned about him and his past with the Ravagers, Sylvester Stallone, and what he was doing for Ego the whole time, how that affected him. I thought it was surprisingly like subtly done and was so masterfully executed at the end, pun not intended, when he actually died. Another big criticism leveled at Marvel movies that there aren't any stakes. And for all that, whatever, I'm sure they could find a way to bring him back. I thought that Yondu was so the emotional core, especially his relationship with Peter, as Peter is developing a relationship with his true father. And I spoke to Michael Rooker, and he corrected me. He's like, I don't think Ego was his true father. I think that Yondu always was his true father. I thought that was just so impactful, and we were all talking a little bit after, and we were talking to some of our other colleagues who've seen it, getting a bit emotional at the end during that funeral, and when Yondu got everyone showing up for him, it was a really powerful ending, and I'm curious if you guys felt the same way.
I was just so happy he got the comic book accurate fin on his head. That was so cool to see him do that and unleash with that. But I totally agree that he really brought it home. Like, I wasn't expecting that much depth for Yondu, and that it really was a great like juxtaposition of father figures, of like your biological father versus like your dad, the person who's actually cared about you. And then there's that quick like 2-second scene of him like teaching Peter how to shoot, I think it was, and I was like, oh my God. And so it really made me feel for Yondu, and I was so upset when he kicked the bucket.
Yeah, I did like the work they did with Yondu, who here I thought there was zero subtlety to his death scene. I mean, it's like, I'm finally going to do something right in this. We're like, all right, dude, we get it.
For all that,
but also, I'm sorry, aren't they kind of taking the same beat, though, from the first movie where Groot sacrifices himself to save the team?
That wasn't permanent.
Well, they didn't know that at that moment, and the audience didn't know that at the moment, but it was I think it just speaks to me a little bit of the sequelitis of we're going to repeat the same beats. I think they needed to make sure Yondu stayed dead, though. And I do wonder, and I have no problem with it if it was, but I did like the sort of the Star Trek II thing of like, the teammate who sacrifices themselves and gets the royal send-off, and it brings a tear to your eye. So I did like a lot of that, and I think it paid off because, we know how much family means in this particular storyline, and the fact that he essentially sacrificed his own honor and his own familial ties in order to do right by Peter. I think that's what makes any of that work. Yeah,
and I think I see where you're coming from with the Groot parallel. That didn't stand out to me, and still it feels different, even though I'm sure that it isn't actually that much. But to your point about his death not being subtle, I thought the build up to it was really well done. You feel this weight on Yondu throughout that whole movie, and there was a point as they were doing this stuff where I was like, you know what? What's next for him? Like, what is his redemption? And then when he sacrificed himself, it was sad and emotional, and not much of a surprise, because I think the movie did a really good job setting up to that decision. It didn't feel like it was out of left field.
You don't think, though, it undercuts the heroism of any of the other members of the team, and that you have a guy who's not a core member of your team ultimately saving the day?
No, I think the Guardians is about a team. Yeah, it's a team. It's not any one character. And
somebody just asking the question.
They did have him be a member of the Guardians.
Yeah,
that was nice.
The frickin' Guardians of the Galaxy. If he didn't say frickin'.
Which is, again, a very good segue. Imagine there are title credits coming up over this part of the podcast, or Spoilercast. But let's talk about the 5 post-credit scenes in this movie. Couple big ones, couple fun ones, but my first question, is 5 too many for a Marvel movie?
I think Guardians can get away with it because they're Guardians. They can be like subversive and go like overboard and do stuff like that. So I feel like if one movie was gonna have 5, I'd like it to be Guardians. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would have been difficult for like an Avengers movie to pull off 5. I think we are so used to the Guardians movies just kind of playing by their own rules that we'd give it a pass. However, it's still. it's still just that the sequelitis thing again of like, oh, you liked 1 or 2 in the first one, we're going to give you 5 now. It's like it's too much of anything isn't always a good thing.
It felt less to me like 5 different post-credit scenes and more like the post-credits parts of movies where you sort of are checking back in with like different characters and it's sort of one part of the same bit. But then after we saw the screenings, it was like, there were 5 in this movie. I was like, oh, I guess there were. And we should list them off. So in order of what I value as importance, there was the Adam.
Adam Warlock.
Adam Warlock post-credit scene. There was the Ravagers sort of setting up that they might come together, and that's like a nod to the original Guardians team. We had Stan Lee with the Watchers, which was another scene that I love that you were like, oh my God, they put the Watchers in a movie.
Yeah. Oh my God.
But also too that it's probably the same Stan Lee from all the movies, and he's just had this incredible life.
There was Teenage Groot. And then, which was funny, and like they had to do that joke, right? Like they had to do Teenage Groot. And then the last one was Sean Gunn's character, who's I'm blanking on his name, Cracklin, testing out the Yondu's arrow, and accidentally hitting Drax.
I will say that all of those, obviously the Adam Warlock one is the one that really is you're always MCU is great about like, well, what's coming up next? What's coming up next? And that's obviously the one where you're like, oh crap, okay.
It's exciting. It's exciting.
There's no accident that James Gunn officially announces he's back for Guardians 3 the day before he does the junket, which is the same day the press finally sees the movie and sees that there's an Adam Warlock Easter egg right there at the end. So we now know.
RGL's own Terry Schwartz asked James Gunn when she interviewed him of just, what's the deal with the Adam Warlock thing? Because we saw a cocoon, which he's known to burst out of in the comics, in the second one in the Collector's Museum. Turns out he admitted that was a mistake. He was just putting that in there for fun. But this is the real Adam Warlock who's in this sort of more tech cocoon who's going to come out. And for those who don't know, really quick, he's a very popular and storied cosmic character who at one point had a infinity gem in his forehead, and it was like the key to bringing down Thanos in the Infinity Gauntlet comic. But as he also told Terry, he's going to sit out Avengers Infinity War and be what we're assuming is the villain along with Aisha, who's his genetic twin in the comics, and they'll be maybe like a brother-sister villain duo, but eventually he becomes a hero in the comics. So I'm thinking maybe by the end of it, he'll join the Guardians or become a force of good.
He'll be the misdirect villain.
I know that was a lot, but
no, I love the constant flux. I was like,
I think it's really interesting, and it made me wonder, like, geez, was that the character they had initially talked to Matthew McConaughey about when he was up for the role? As opposed to the ego.
It actually, in an interview with Slash Film, I believe, James Gunn did say that originally Adam Warlock was supposed to be a main character in this in Guardians Volume 2, and then I think it was the right decision to hold it in Guardians.
They had a lot. One too much,
But the post-credits, I don't think they needed the Stan Lee one because they already got the bit. I was shocked. I turned to Tara and I was like, oh my God. And I was like, oh, that's Uatu. And she's like, what? But no, so I was really, really happy. I don't think they needed to go back to it, although it's cute, it's fine. The Teen Groot one, I think, as on top of that being funny and him being like angsty Teen Groot, I think it's also just an indicator to the audience that, hey, he's actually growing like a weed, and he'll by the time we see him again in Avengers Infinity War, he'll probably be full adult-sized Groot.
Because the movie opens in 1980 and then they say 34 years later, so Volume 2 actually takes place, 3 years ago in the MCU timeline. So it's, by the time we get to Infinity War and obviously Volume 3, there'll have been some catch-up there.
Which that'll be interesting to find out what the Guardians are up to, 3 years.
I think they said it's almost a 4-year gap. I think Feige said that. Which is crazy to think about, but let's not.
It's just going to make my head hurt. But let's also talk, the other one I want to talk about is the Ravagers showing up. And Jim or Josh, can you guys sort of explain what that is a nod to with the Michelle Yeoh and Ving Rhames and Sylvester Stallone characters?
It's the old 1960s lineup, the original lineup of the Guardians that Yondu was part of. And even though they don't call themselves Guardians in this one, I just love that there's an acknowledgement that they're that these characters existed before, and you know.
And they're played by like this incredible lineup.
Yes.
Yeah,
That could be
Ving
a
Rhames,
whole
Michelle
movie.
Yeoh, Stallone,
Because in the comics,
Miley Cyrus.
yeah. Oh yeah, she's mainframe. Yeah. So in the Stallone, he's playing Stakar, who in the comics is Starhawk, which is crazy to just think about that. That he's actually because he had the weird things on his shoulder. That was a really big nod to his costume in the comics. So it was cool to see that because that group made up the original Guardians. And to see them there, like again, like all assembled, like nerd chills everywhere, and yeah, where could they go with it? And I know, again, he told you.
I was gonna plug myself.
Let me plug you. But that he told Terry that their journey's not over. That wasn't just a wink. Like we'll probably see them again in some fashion. So that would be awesome to see in the future.
I am very excited about it. I got just so excited about Michelle Yeoh being like as someone who loves all those films like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and everything like that.
Yeah.
She's just such a badass actress that it was a real treat.
And Ving Rhames too. You know, it was a really pleasant surprise, and I'm glad. You know, there have been some rumblings that some of these characters might pop up in the movie, but at a certain point in the rumor mill, there's so much bull that's out there that you just kind of tune it out. So I was glad that they were able to keep this under wraps, that Michelle Yeoh and Ving Rhames were in there. Obviously, the Stallone stuff got out early, but it was a great surprise.
And who knows, maybe one day the MCU, when we get to Phase 4, becomes a bit non-linear and is an excuse to, you know, bring back Michael Rooker as Yondu. They could always do something that's more like the original, you know, Ravager / Guardians team going out on adventures pre-Ego. Like that would be something I'd be interested to see.
In the comics, they called it Guardians 3000, where they did something like that. And they often would do time travel, so they could go back and get Yondu and have the original gang back together.
As we're undercutting our own, talking about how we hope that death stays permanent. So those are a lot of thoughts that we had on Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. We definitely want to know what you guys thought about the movie, so make sure to chime in the comment section below. And for all things MCU, it's endless. It's endless. We're going to keep going with this franchise forever. Keep it locked on IGN.